questions. What is Atlas 14? Who published it? How did they develop it? Why is it important? Why may it be important? How can we access this information? As you'll see, it'll be really easy as long as our network connection's good. But if you have internet, it's very easy. What did we previously use before this information? How does Atlas 14 compare to that information we previously used, which was called TP40 or Technical Paper 40? How does Atlas 14 affect my community or my level of work? Who has adopted Atlas 14 to date? What should be done to respond to Atlas 14? How does Atlas 14 affect the wetland world? And I'll be calling on Travis for some of that, as I am not as tied to that stuff as you guys are. And just open discussion and questions. So I have a video that may or may not open. It's kind of a funny video.
Exactly.
Okay, it doesn't, I might not be able to get it. It's just a video. It's a young kid in New Bright, Minnesota, and he's taking a picture of, there was about 5 inches of rain in an hour that they got, and he says this is what happens. And it's just funny hearing his dialogue, but I don't think we'll probably won't get it. But, just showing the water, just basically like a river through the street and then through their backyard, basically. So, now it's compromised in all presentation. Sorry about that. All right, so what is Atlas 14? This is a document that basically takes all the known rainfall information from stations collected through all around the country, mainly in our area, in the Midwest, and interprets that rainfall. And it's intended to take that information and then use it to design our stormwater systems. It predicts the probability of how much rain will fall in a given period of time. So, for example, the 1% rainfall is anticipated to occur once every 100 years. What is that rainfall and how often should it occur? As stated before, this data replaces previously used TP40 information, and that information used data gathered at airports and weather stations up until 1961, which, as you can imagine, has increased exponentially in the last 50 years. Now, people in their backyards are recording rainfall every 5 minutes, so the data is exponentially better now than it was with the previously published information. So who published it? And that's NOAA, NOAA, National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. This is a federal agency responsible for developing and interpreting the rainfall information and probabilities. And if you go on their website, or if you went on their website during the recent federal shutdown, it was one of those situations where you couldn't get to the website. But I went to it a couple days later, and even though the government was shut down, they must have been getting complaints at how many people are interested in this topic. And you were able to, again, access that information, which is a little bit odd with a government entity like that once they shut down, if you remember when the state shut down, you couldn't get to their construction permits and anything like that. So it tells you how highly targeted this information is right now. So Minnesota was part of Volume 8, which comprised of 11 states and 11 Midwestern states. And they further broke that into 4 climatic regions. And the precipitation measurements then from all the stations were from over 16,000 stations, which prior to 1961, it would have been Minneapolis Airport, St. Paul Airport, St. Cloud Airport. It wouldn't have been hundreds of thousands of stations there. So why is this information important? Me as a water resource engineer, and some of this stuff you may be interested in, may not affect wetlands at all, but I'm going to go through a lot of the water resource implications, and then we'll start talking about the wetland stuff. But it'll be used to establish floodplain footprint and elevations. So your FEMA maps and what the DNR publishes, the spreads and the footprints of those flood areas and flood zones are developed using typically the 100-year information or the 1% rainfall event. And now that new information is coming out, when that's modeled, some of those areas may increase and additional homes or businesses may be required to purchase flood insurance. It'll also be used to determine the size of stormwater ponds, pipes, and other features that may need to drastically increase to be able to handle the predicted rainfalls now. So I think this will work here. This is how can we access the information. This may be what you're most interested in. So if you can just go to Google, type in Atlas 14. Pretty much click on any of these links. Can everyone hear me okay?
See, I have a basic question.
Yeah.
So the assumption is that the earlier data underrepresented what the rainfall would be. You're saying it's only, the footprint's going to get bigger.
Some of the floodplains may get bigger. Some may stay the same. It'll be based on, the land use in that area. It'll be based on the type of soils, the contours around that area. But yeah, so it's not necessarily to jump to conclusions that we're more likely now to get more rain. It's just our data and all the information leading up to this point. This is all based on fact now that we have all this information that's been collected, and it appears that what we had previously thought it's not wrong, it's just not as accurate as the information we have today. Now we have 100-fold more information.
So I think it's like underrepresented. I mean, if
Yep.
for some reason.
Yep,
Yeah.
and people would raise the question, is this global climate change? Maybe. I mean, there's really no answer to that, but so this is on Noaa's website. Very, very user-friendly. Wi-Fi connection here may not be the same. So it just comes up with a map of the United States. Click on Minnesota. You can see in the handouts, if you have one, the map that would show up, and it has a little red cursor on it. Wherever I decide I want to click and drag that cursor to, you can zoom in and you can put the cursor on your house if you want to do. It'll spit out a table, all this information, and I put a table in your packet at the very end, one of the last 2 pages. And that shows an example of the data that you would receive from any location. And it basically shows the frequency, duration, rainfall event. And what that means is the duration is how long would it rain, from 5 minutes to 60 days. And then the average reoccurrence interval is this the 1 year storm, so a 99% chance of it occurring on a given year? Or is it the 100-year storm, 1% chance? And then it'll give you the typical rainfall. So if you look at the chart, for the 24-hour, typically we design things on a 1-day event or a 24-hour event. And the 1% would be more of your flood elevation. Sometimes when you go to design storm sewer and different things like that, it's maybe a 5 or a 10-year design. But if you look at the 100-year, you go down 24-hour, 100-year, this location, I think I actually picked this right around Bloomington, if I remember right. And it's about 7.5 inches. If you look at the next table in your packet, the previous 24-hour 1% was 5.9 inches. So you're looking at about a 25% increase in rainfall for an unlikely or less likely rainfall event. So back to this website, if I move that cursor, and let's say I move it from Bloomington, and I move it down to Burnsville, all of that information in that, all of the information in this table will update and change. In fact, it could even change if you move from block to block. The change would probably be, hundredths of an inch at that level, but it's doing that in relation to all the stations that have been used for data collection over the years, and it's trying to give you the best probability and frequency for that rainfall in that location. So that may be very helpful, and Travis can get into that a little bit later when looking at maybe a project by project wetland investigation. So also for those that are interested in GIS or Excel formats, you can really easily click, convert, and spit that information into Excel or into GIS. And I have a few maps that you can see that were made from the information here in a few slides. So it's very easy to access and very useful information. Any questions on that website at all? There's a lot of areas of the website I haven't even investigated, but for what I do, I typically click on Minnesota, look at my project or my city and see what the rainfalls and the probabilities might be, and use that either in making policy decisions or making design decisions. There's a picture of that on the table. This is that technical paper 40 I talked about that is in your handout as well. And this is the amount of information that we had prior to Atlas 14. Atlas 14 came out earlier this year. And so you can see the big discrepancy or the big difference in information. It's not that one is right or wrong, it's just that now Atlas 14 is using more statistical information. So here's a map that they publish in their report, and I think you can read it. The blue lines show what we used to know, and that was TP40, and it's 5-inch rainfall, 6-inch rainfall, 7-inch rainfall. That was the 100-year or 1% occurrence. And then the shading behind shows the increase or decrease. If you look out, there are spots in South Dakota and Nebraska and down in Missouri that actually saw a decrease in rainfall. So it's not that everywhere saw an increase in rainfall, it was just more accurate information. So that shows kind of the percent change. And Minnesota typically went up from anywhere between 5 and 25% more runoff, more rainfall. This just shows a quick comparison of TP40 and Atlas 14 for that site I did in Bloomington. In analyzing the information, it does appear that there's more increase for the large infrequent rainfall events, the 100-year or the big downpours that we experience, that maybe those are increasing a little bit more. The smaller events, the 1 year, 2 year, 10-year events, not nearly as much increase. This map just kind of looks at the different areas around the state, highlights a few cities and the percent change at those cities. See if there's anything, like St. Cloud, for instance, the 10-year, which is a typical storm sewer design, actually went down by a couple percent. So just offers a lot of challenges with more information. This is one of the maps I made in GIS, exporting that data for the state of Minnesota. This is zoomed in on the metropolitan area, but it has a new, they're called isopluvials, the rainfall data, and it shows that, you know, here down in Edina or Bloomington, you're looking at about 7.5 inches, but as you get up to Brooklyn Park, Blaine, you may be down 7.2 inches for a 100-year rainfall event. So significantly more information is available, and it just provides more accurate information than TP40 did. So how might this affect our communities or cities and counties as they go forward in design? Stormwater management improvements may increase, may need larger ponds, more land for the ponds. Pipes may need to be larger, may increase the 100-year flood elevation and discharge rates. So depending on watershed, a lot of watersheds limit the rate leaving the land, you know, in the 210 and 100-year event. Well, what's interesting about this is your existing rate would also go up with this information. You're putting more rain on your existing condition as well. So in some ways, as we've investigated, the cost may not even increase. May reduce and eliminate freeboard, which is a big policy discussion nowadays at cities, is if we had a standard of 1 foot or 2 foot of freeboard, and now we're throwing more rainfall into these ponds, are there areas where houses aren't as protected as we wanted them to be, that we'd have to focus projects or improvements to get them back into compliance with our standards? So it may increase the footprint of FEMA floodplain. I'll talk about that a little bit more when I talk about other agencies that are adopting this. Based on that 27% increase in rainfall, the runoff actually may increase by 28 to 58%, 28 to 60%, because you're talking about throwing 7.5 inches of rain on a site instead of 6. That last 1.5 inches is almost completely runoff as the ground's already saturated from the initial runoff, so for the initial rainfall. So it can be a really big deal on certain sites depending on soils and land use. This gets pretty detailed for engineering analysis here, but it just shows the increase in volume and discharge using TP40 or LS14 for the different. So curve number 61, I don't know how familiar you are, curve number 61 may just be a standard soil in the metro area, whereas a 98 is an impervious coverage. So from impervious coverage, you know, you're increasing about what the rainfall increase is. For pervious coverage, you're increasing more runoff because of those saturated soils. So then we've done a lot of analysis here on how this could affect communities, and we took and said, if we have a pond design and we have a 24-inch outlet, people are all worried, developers are worried, how much land is this going to take? It actually, you could maybe use the same pond and just have a bigger outlet. So depending on the situation and the soils and all that, it may not be that big of a deal for pond design. So who's adopted this? We've contacted agencies have contacted us to make sure we're using their standard. MnDOT is recognizing Atlas 14 as the standard moving forward. Some of the state projects that are happening right now get grandfathered in, or if the design had already begun. But, you know, come next year, most projects will be using Atlas 14 and the updated information. The DNR and FEMA has adopted this information. Now, sometimes it takes them 10, 20 years to update a map, depending on the models and what goes into it. So they will be using this information when map updates are completed, but all the maps that are completed right now, they won't be just going and changing that information. It'll be more when an update is done, they'll use the latest and greatest information. Some watersheds have started to implement it, and a lot of cities are a little leery to just, I mean, they know that it's ultimately going to have to happen, but since watersheds are the regulatory agency for dealing with a lot of the stormwater stuff in the communities, municipalities are waiting a little bit on the watersheds, but ultimately we've seen a lot starting to undertake ordinance revisions and policy changes. So what needs to be done then? And this is kind of focusing on the city's standpoint, what would need to be done. A study would likely be a good idea on problem areas or on areas where existing flood elevations would likely change, those areas where a housing development went around a recently constructed pond or something like that. Freeboard to structures and roads. It's not more likely to flood this year than it was last year or the year 2000, but as engineers, we're kind of responsible for using the latest and greatest information.
What's freeboard?
Sorry about that. Freeboard is the distance, like from, you could have freeboard to your lowest opening in your house, so it's the distance from the high water of a pond or a river or a lake to your low opening at your house, or to it overtopping a road. That's the difference. If you model that, then it's like a safety factor. You have that safety factor. And FEMA requires 1 foot. A lot of cities go that extra mile and do 2 or 3 feet to protect the residents. And there's just a lot of unknowns. Even when you put together a nice detailed hydrologic model, you still want to have, the rain never falls, even like Atlas 14 says, it never falls exactly 7.5 inches in exactly 24 hours. The video I was going to show was 5 inches of rain, and it happened in like an hour in New Brighton. So the storm sewer didn't really have a chance. But. So cities are then looking at updating ordinances, updating stormwater management plans, possibility of studies to retrofit existing systems as needed, updating the stormwater utility fees that, you know, to help pay for some of this stuff. All these things are happening right now. They're looking at what needs to be done, what do they have to do. So the urgency right now is new development. I highlighted in red, that's probably the biggest urgency. Let's not cause more problems when developers come in, when new development happens. These cities are likely to require this Atlas 14 being used, so they don't have to come back in and retrofit a development that was done 2 years prior. The existing development is a little bit tougher. It's more of a, we need to study this area. If we had 3 feet of safety factor or freeboard, is it okay if we just have 2 feet? Can we have an emergency overflow that conveys water once every 25 years? Is that acceptable? So there's a lot of decisions that go into this. FEMA, FIRM, a lot of acronyms here, but FIRM is flood insurance rate map, and then letter of map revision, certified letter of map revision. Those are things that need to be done if you want to debate or change a flood zone on a FEMA map. Like I said, FEMA is adopting this information, but until updated modeling or updated mapping happens, there won't be changes. But if you go after these LOMRs or CLMRs, you would likely have to use this Atlas 14 information. So and this is a good opportunity for me to discuss this with you guys too, because all different organizations, that's what these were about, is it's just trying to develop the best way for counties and cities and watershed districts and the people that work together to adopt this in the most efficient way possible. And so it's good that everyone's aware of this. It's kind of funny. Good one for this weekend, I guess. Any questions on some of that information? I got a couple more slides that Travis knows a lot more than me about wetlands. So, he asked me how this would affect wetlands, and I said, I don't know that much about wetlands.
So as I said on this presentation like you did, first thing came to mind is how does it affect us directly? Right now and moving into the future. I guess one kind of open-ended question for all of you is, do you know of any agencies like local government units that are using this as a standard or have revised their ordinances or policies as it relates to maybe wetland mitigation design standards or discharge rates from storm sewers going into existing wetlands? There's a few around the metro that I've worked with. They haven't adopted it formally, but they're talking about it. That's something that I think we'll maybe see in the future at a local level, but also maybe at Bowser and from the Corps of Engineers to further define using this new data set. One big question that came to mind is we're all used to the 30th to 70th percentile of a normal period, and that's based off of the WETS table, which is data from 1971 to 2000. Now that Atlas 14 has greater accuracy for different parts of the state, can triangulate that data better and give us a better idea of what is normal. Are we going to see a difference in those WETS tables from NRCS? Are we going to see different values being used? That's something that I think is going to be discussed in the future, and we may see it on our end of things when we're doing slide reviews for farmed wetlands or looking at potential new wetland sites. Also redefined floodplains, hydrology indicators, geomorphic position I think is a big one. If we have new areas that are now 100-year floodplains, taking that in consideration, that may change the outcome of a delineation to make it wetland or not wetland, depending on what you're looking at. If you're using kind of the other checkbox on the hydrology indicators for gauge or well monitoring data, that may have an effect on that as well. I think the biggest change, or the biggest effect that we'll see is the mitigation design standards in Lacca. As you see there, 8420, I highlighted that for you, but within that language, we have a max of a 24-inch rise for the 10-year storm event. So that comes to the question of, if we are designing a mitigation area, if it's not adopted by policy, will it be by that LGU or by those TEP members that are looking at that? Within WAC, it doesn't state what standard we're supposed to use for designing those when looking at modeling data. There's a lot of language within 8420 in that subsection as far as pre-treatment and facility separation from creating existing wetlands. If we have to maintain a certain discharge rate from an existing storm sewer going into, let's say, a created wetland or an existing wetland, I think those are all factors that, are questions that need to be answered in the next coming years as we work through this. And the big part, regulatory, everything kind of comes back to that. Existing stormwater facilities, is there potential to create incidental wetlands? Do we have an argument that if we're looking at, let's say, a wetland that we delineated, we found that through a slide review it wasn't there 10, 15 years ago, but a pond was put in 20 years ago? Is that kind of in our toolbox to say that maybe that's an incidental wetland? And this data could help us make that argument in some cases. I guess I just wanted to open up with discussion if anyone has seen this, either through submitting applications to LGUs, or if you are an LGU, if there's been any talk about using this new data for any type of the applications that you've prepared or submitted the last year or so. This came out
Spring this year.
spring of this year, so it's pretty new.
I don't have any discussion, but can you explain more when you're talking about how this relates to incidental wetlands?
There might be, if you delineate it as wetland, and let's say it wasn't wetland through slide review 10, 15 years ago, but a pond was put in, and that pond, maybe through Atlas 14 is undersized based on the current data. You know, is it something that could be used, Atlas 14, for that specific project to help justify that it was incidentally created so it's not regulated? Or depending on the timelines, kind of on a case-by-case scenario?
Are you talking about an overflow area from a?
Yeah, an overflow from an undersized pond, basically.
Okay.
Yeah, to help justify that water is being pushed there due to development.
Is there any other questions or points of discussion? Well, I appreciate you coming out for the forum. I think our next forum is, Jed, help me out, December. Do we have one?
Yes.
Coming up in December, and that one's going to, I believe, talk about frog calls. Mark can elaborate on that wherever he is.
Yep.
We took-
Heidi Sher from the DNR is going to come in and talk about, she's got a frog survey program where people go out and listen for frog calls. And her coming and talk.
Okay. Well, thanks for coming. Have a good afternoon.
Thank you. Did someone need a handout? I do your school. I have one left. Handout, do you need one? Do you get one? I got one more. I think there was a couple short ones. The NRC has not redone this. How rainfall falls for our area yet, so that is an area kind of wait and see. So there's still like, we're using the type 2 distribution is what we're in right now, and that's kind of just we're still using that type 2 until an NRC gives us something else.
Precision versus accuracy.
So, yeah, with all this information, we should be able to develop. That's half the
When I
battle,
shoot
how
that
fast
deer,
we're getting the rainfall.
Right,
We have projects that stretch over a couple miles.
Yeah, and we're going through that a little bit. As you look at the city, and it might change 3/4 of an inch from north to south of the city. So you develop your policies. You probably can develop it in a worst case scenario. Because it could develop into an administrative that, you know, well, this neighborhood is on 7.1 inch. This neighborhood is 7 is like, I don't, a lot of people are basically talking about that right now, and I just see it as being, we're gonna use the worst case scenario for the scenario. I should have an idea. Like, okay, so there's that project is, and that's great. Of course, that's why I have 6 spots of the project, and that's what project. Oh, I did. Well, on anyone very.
Well, not just that.
Some of the areas are people like.
We also
My school,
Because
Noah published a lot of people ask me questions, when are you gonna get it?
they may be more willing to say, oh, it's about a slight higher standard.
So if they say you have to be.
You can't change it every 2 years.
They had no. It wasn't gonna happen.
So weird.
But I think that
Mark, I'm wondering about that.
Oh, I know, it's for the.
Probably, yeah.